Hi, my name is Brandon, and I'd like to welcome you to the very first video podcast episode for Crucible of Thought. You can consider this a bit of an experiment. After about 100 audio-only episodes, I've decided that I'd really like to start interviewing some people that have caught my attention and are saying things that I'd like to understand further. And if I'm going to do that, I think it's going to need to be a video-based interview, and so I'm going to need to develop some recording and interviewing skills that I just don't have yet. So this is my very first attempt at such a recording, and a good friend of mine, also named Brandon, agreed to spend some time with me testing out some recording and editing methods and software that I'm going to need to refine. Brandon and I both attended the same church for quite a few years, and then we both stopped attending at about the same time as we both individually went through a time of rethinking the fundamentals of our faith and our doctrines. The topic for today's discussion is tithing, and it's mainly because it's just something I've been thinking about this week and something I'm pretty sure we both have some thoughts about. And because we both basically agree, it's a pretty smooth discussion, and I hope you'll find some value in it as we bounce some ideas off of each other. So here we go, and I hope you enjoy this episode. So the topic for our chat would be about tithing, and both of us are expats from a local church, and I think we've probably both come to some similar conclusions, but I've never actually talked to you about it, so I was kind of curious where you stand on some of these things. So I wanted to start by pointing out that from what I see, tithing in the Bible is often discussed in light of Abraham's tithe to Melchizedek, some commands in Leviticus and Numbers describing tithing to support the temple and the Levites, Jesus' comments to the Pharisees about their tithing practices, the verse about not muzzling the ox that treads the grain, which I think gets used a lot to talk about paying the pastor their dues, and probably the most often quote that I see in Malachi about bring the whole tithe into the storehouse and how that leads to a flood of blessing. So that's the hermeneutic that I came into this with. I've recently been rethinking my position on this, and I'm kind of curious what you have heard yourself. Are there others, or are those kind of the well-rounded ones?
Yeah, those are the primary scripture verses that I seem to recall being spouted at us. The other big one is that I remember specifically hearing a lot was I think it was out of Matthew 6, where a man's treasure is, there his heart is also.
Yep.
Uh, that was a very very big one that was used quite frequently, particularly when people were out of line in terms of whether they were
Expectations.
tithing, whether they were tithing or not tithing.
Did you ever hear quoted the concepts about Ananias and Sapphira in the context of tithing?
Um, I don't specifically remember hearing that. I've read stuff and seen other things, not necessarily in the context at the church where we were at, but I have seen that before. Yes.
Okay. So I guess the big question that we kind of have to settle as believers in a, let's call it a post-institutional church position is, do those concepts and commands apply to us post-cross? A lot of the stuff is from the Old Testament. There's a few from the New Testament, but most of it's from the Old Testament. So does that really hit us as believers in Jesus?
It's very interesting to me that much of the church in general is very quick to dismiss much of the law, saying that the law no longer applies to us because we're free in Christ.
Right.
But they conveniently seem to leave out the fact that the tithe was part
The
of all
law.
that, and they try to use the high priest of Melchizedek, that whole argument that Jesus is the high priest in the line of Melchizedek, as the argument for sustaining the tithe. Uh, yeah, I have moved to the position, I think, where I do not see the tithe as something that is um, obligatory. I guess I don't see it that way anymore. I think there is much goodness in supporting people and supporting those things that you believe God is working in, but to make it an obligation, seems to make it fall right back under the law again in my view.
Okay. Um, so thinking about what Malachi said for a moment, it's a very transactional verse, and I think one of the things that you and I both have deconstructed, if you will, is the idea of a very transactional gospel, that God desires to bless us and affirm us as his own regardless of our actions. But certainly, I don't think that denies the idea that he pays attention to what we do and he affirms actions that we take that are in line with his principles. But the the quote in Malachi is very strongly transactional. It's not just a little bit transactional. It's like God will flood you with blessings if you bring the tithe into the storehouse. So how do you feel about that? I mean, I certainly have my thoughts, but I'm curious where yours go first.
Um,
I mean, I'm throwing a softball.
yeah. My first gut reaction to that scripture verse is kind of if I could put up the puke face emoji, that would be my that would be my reaction, because it it pulls me in the direction of the prosperity gospel, and I just have no stomach for the prosperity gospel whatsoever. And this idea that God is this cosmic vending machine, that if you just do these things, He's going to bless you. It's just not how the gospel works. It's just not how God works in general. That whole transactional thing is just it's just gross to me. I've not spent a lot of time on that particular verse trying to break it down any other way than transactional, other than to think that much of the Israelite faith at that time was very transactional. That was
Sure.
their relationship with the Lord. And I think he honored that, and was the Lord was okay with that. But I think he's moved his people past that. So
So that points to a fundamental. I hate to use that word these days, but an underlying hermeneutic of our thought process these days, which is that the Bible is, certainly for me, a record of man's struggle to understand God and his character and his nature, not an end to end set of prescriptions and proscriptions to be followed exactly as written. That there were phases of humanity's interactions with God that got us to increasing understanding of him, but that's not even necessarily complete today. And I think based on what you're saying, you kind of would agree with that.
yeah, I think there's a great deal more wisdom to be found in the Bible when you approach it from the standpoint, almost the same way a person would approach their own genealogy and their family history. It's the same sort of thing when you approach it with that perspective of saying, what are those things that those who came before me learned? Where are the places where they messed up? Where are the places where maybe they got it wrong? Because clearly there's times in the Old Testament where, I can't believe that God advocated for genocide. I just that's not something I can wrap my head around if we believe in a good God. So therefore, that must mean that the people relaying this story screwed it up somewhere along the way. This was this was their view of God, and so there's so many things I think that can be looked at that way, and there's a much deeper richness to things when you evaluate people and you evaluate this work based on the understanding that they're flawed human beings just like we are. However, the wisdom that can be gleaned from those lessons is the value.
Yeah.
That's the value in it for me, is seeing that and knowing that um, that that God continues to still do the things that He does in spite of what we see recorded right in front of our eyes. We see recorded the wickedness of men.
And
You know,
sometimes questionable behavior by the deity that's presented as God.
yeah, all this wickedness, and yet God still continues to move and push His kingdom forward despite all that wickedness. um I don't know, there's just a great deal of value in that for me, and that brings me more hope than this book that would sit in front of me.
Sure. Well, it becomes a relational thing instead of a mental thing.
Yep.
So, okay. So a mutual friend of ours, and I'm not going to name names, and you might be able to guess who it is.
Hmm.
I think he's starting to feel like maybe that church isn't serving his needs anymore. But he's been involved for decades, and his financial trust advice is trusted by quite a few people. But that certainly sounds like a step away from what we were always taught, partly by him, was biblical stewardship of our money. And so I was curious if you had any thoughts about that. Like, what do you remember was specifically taught to us at that church about tithing?
So I had I can relay my relationship in terms of what I went through um, when I showed up at the church that we used to go to. My financial state was an absolute wreck. I was coming out of my first marriage. I had filed for bankruptcy about a year, maybe 2 years prior to showing up to the church, um, and and so my finances were just an absolute mess. And then me and my wife were looking to get married. Her finances weren't great, and so we walked into this situation, and almost immediately I got tagged as somebody who had leadership potential. Um, and so I started volunteering a great deal of time doing men's ministry, ushering, all kinds of different things I was doing there at the church, volunteering a ton of time. Um, and and then I got approached about joining the trustees at the church, and it was
And
at
just
that
for
point.
anyone who doesn't know, I mean, typically the trustees are the people that manage the financial affairs of the church as an 501c3 or some other
Yeah,
formal institution. It's a required legal position.
yeah. So I got approached about joining the trustees, and at that time the administrator at the church ran I don't know, ran my name through their system there at the church and discovered that I wasn't tithing regularly. They weren't seeing anything coming from me on a regular basis in terms of a tithe. So I was approached by the lead pastor, um, and the verse that was used was, "Where a man's treasure is, there his heart is also." And so, therefore, if you wanted to be in leadership at the church, you had to demonstrate that you were willing to commit financially, not just your time, but you had to be willing to commit financially to this church, because it was it was by extension um, part of God's plan on this planet, so to speak. It was a direct extension of God, and so therefore you needed to financially support this thing. And these people were watching out for you, and they couldn't trust somebody to help manage the finances of the church if they didn't think that this person was interested in supporting the church financially. I made some vain attempts at the time to kind of halfway explain my situation, even though I really didn't, because it was super embarrassing to try to explain to them why I wasn't tithing. It wasn't a matter of a poor heart position. It was just I was financially a wreck. But those questions weren't asked. Those questions were never asked. It was just assumed that I didn't want to tithe, so therefore my name was withdrawn for consideration for but I was also threatened that my leadership position at the time, because I had also just started on the leadership team, the core leadership team there at the church. Not quite sure how to describe that position other than maybe kind of like, it wasn't really an elder. I
I
wasn't
think it was
on.
as close to elders as we had.
Yeah, I wasn't on staff at the church, but I was a core ministry leader. Um, that was in jeopardy if I didn't straighten this situation out and trust in God for my financial well being. Um,
So there's something to dig at there. We'll come back to that.
yeah, so I for multiple weeks, this produced a great deal of anxiety in me as I wrestled with this, trying to figure out, because when I broached my wife with this subject, her simple response was, is I'm not going to be willing to make my family destitute and not pay my bills and put food on the table or do these things simply because the church wants me to give them money to do things that I could give I could care less about. I could care less about their Bible studies or their, like, I need to take care of my family. Um, so it created a pretty big rift between my wife and I at the time. And so ultimately what was decided was that I would tithe 10% of my income, but she wasn't going to tithe because she just did not, she felt like it was extortion. We were being extorted. Um, to, if you want to be in leadership, you have to give us your money. So um, that was my experience with tithing at the church where we went, and it left a really bad taste in my mouth. But I never openly challenged it because there was some other stuff with myself personally that I desperately wanted to be part of that leadership group. I wanted to be on the inside, in the inner circle, if you will. And so I wasn't going to buck that. I wasn't going to challenge it. I wasn't, even though it made me feel completely gross and disgusting. I just wasn't going to challenge it because it wasn't worth what I would lose if I did.
So, a few interesting things to poke at there. Certainly, one of them is the idea of trusting God to fix the problem, if you will, to meet the needs so that you could tithe. I certainly heard that kind of a flavor throughout my Christian upbringing, that if we trusted God, not only would He do the Malachi thing about leading to a flood of blessing, but it would be so that we could tithe more, which is an interestingly self-serving assertion, isn't it? Um, and I think I always heard the idea that God would provide for His church so that the church could provide for God's needs, which is maybe not the right way to put it. It certainly wasn't put that way, but certainly so that God could could carry out the kingdom growth on the earth as the church was faithful to bring the tithe into the storehouse. And so it's a very circular kind of a flavor to the thing, that there would be increase to the kingdom because we were faithful to tithe. And the interesting thing to me, looking back on that, is this sense that, hey, does God need us to execute His kingdom? Or does He allow us to be participants in something which is far bigger than us and does not depend on us at all? And I think I tend more to that these days than I did before. Um, so that's one interesting thing. And feel free to respond if you want. Um, I do want to poke at this question of extortion, which I think is certainly a loaded word, but I think it's certainly not an uncommon sense among the people who walk away from Christianity that the church was doing that to them.
Yeah, it's so I use that word. I don't I don't for a minute believe that anybody in leadership at that church was intentionally extorting
Yeah,
anybody. There was
absolutely.
no intentional malice anywhere in any of this. There's this fundamental belief, and I think it's so baked into the system at this point. It's so baked in because how do you how it was never about furthering the church as I'll call the ecclesia, the called out ones in the Bible. It was never about furthering that. It was about furthering the institutional church and the preservation of the institutional church. And the
Yeah,
way that you do that is you have to have money coming in. This is how you keep the temple. How do you keep the temple standing? You have to keep pumping money into this thing to keep. You got to pay that mortgage. You got to pay the taxes on the land if there's taxes. Of course, we don't have to worry about that in the United States, but um, you have to pay those things. You have the paid ministers, the paid pastor, the paid staff. You got to pay all those people, and so ultimately I've come to the conclusion that I would flip Matthew 6 on its head and ask that question back to the church. Where is your treasure at? because that's going to reveal to me where your heart is.
To the institution, not to the
To
people.
to the institution.
Say
That's
that
I'm
again.
going to
So
flip that.
ask the institution where the institution's heart is.
Yeah, where's your treasure at? Where's your treasure at? Because your treasure isn't in the people. Your treasure isn't in those people who are hurting, those people who are poor, who are destitute. Your treasure's in a building. Your treasure's in paid pastoral staff. Your treasure isn't out there supporting the world. It isn't out there supporting these people that Jesus tells us to go help. So I flip it around on this institutional church and I say, how dare you question me and my integrity and my heart towards God when all I got to do is look at you and
Huh.
look at you as the institution, and I can say, yeah, no, I don't want to give my money to that thing, to this monster that just continues to gobble up, and maybe I don't know, I think you had quoted to me at one point in time a certain small percentage of our money actually only ever goes to anything other than outside those four walls.
Yeah. So I actually did go back because I had been a trustee for a while, and I pulled up some of the older uh, financial documents that I had. And on average, well, let's just look at 2021, I guess, was the last year for which I was participating in that. The church gave almost exactly 10% of its income to missional activity, as opposed to, the building, the uh, the insurance, the utilities, the staff salaries, um, things to make the ministry work internal to the building, like the sound system, the uh, the money that went to the little weekly ministry meetings and things like that, buying supplies, that kind of stuff. So basically, 90% of the money was rolled into the institution and not to anything outside the church. Now, certainly some, you know, the church exists, the institution exists to serve the people that attend it in large. Um,
Yep.
and so that's, understandable that some amount of that money needs to go for that, but it's 90%. And that's for a church of 200 to 250 people. If you look at the average across America, it's much closer to 3 or 4%. And when you look at the largest churches, like the mega churches, it's well under 1%. Churches like Tilton's church used to have such numbers. It was like 0.8% for those mega churches. And so it's a tiny fraction.
Yeah. We we're very quick as Americans, and I can't speak to anywhere else, but I know, like, one of the things I judge on whether I'm going to give my money to any sort of institution, charitable institution, is how much of my dollar makes it towards the thing that they say that they're going to go do.
Sure.
And
Well, and
if an institution is only giving 10 cents at the most of my dollar, they're not going to get my money
Well,
because
so I think if you understand what the money's tagged for, you can give with a good heart. And our church used to say that every penny that comes in for a special offering with a designated purpose would go. Every single penny, and I believe that they did that. As
yep.
one who was in the financial accounting, oversight as a trustee, that was understood to be exactly what happened. But um, I don't think that most of the people understood how little actually went to those missional things. And so I think there's good and bad there, right? And the other thing that I guess I object to ultimately was the idea that on one occasion I said I want to give I want a certain amount of my tithe to go towards this purpose that I think is important. This activity that the church is participating in outside its walls. And the answer that I was given, almost verbatim, was, if you designate the money that you're giving, it's no longer a tithe, it's now an offering. And it doesn't count towards your 10%. That the unspoken part was that we judge whether you're a fit member of, church leadership. So
Yeah,
we
yeah.
can't say what we want the money to go towards. So we just have to accept that church balance sheet, the budget sheet. And if we want something else to be going for a particular purpose, well, that needs to be extra giving.
It's like, you had the laws, in the old, the old Jewish customs. You had the laws, and then you had the rabbis who attached hundreds of more little stipulations to each of those laws to make sure you're faithfully following them. And that's exactly what that sounds like.
Sure.
That's like, oh, well, that's the law, but if you don't do it this way, then it's really not, you're really not being faithful to that thing.
And what
So
this
it,
starts to sound like is the conversation we had about um, boundary boundary churches versus centered set churches.
yeah, I think the thing that angered me the most, or still angers me the most to this day, about my own particular experience with tithing there was the fact that I was an individual who was clearly, at least from my point of vantage point, was clearly committed to this place. I was giving freely of my time and my talents and pouring myself into this place on a level that most people didn't. And as soon as it became apparent that I wasn't financially supporting, my level of participation in leadership was curtailed until I demonstrated that, oh, he was actually going to fall in line and give the 10%. But there was never any questions asked. There was nobody sat down with me to say, what is your financial circumstance? Like, tell me why it is.
Mm-hmm.
Why can you not give 10%? There was never any question in that. Um, and and that's very telling. That's very telling when you have an individual, because at the time I was, let's see, I would have been 20. How old would I have been at that time? This would have been, so I was 27, 28 years old, something like that at the time. So how do you have a young person who had a divorce. He's in a relationship with a woman. They have a kid together. They're not married. So a person can start putting two and two together. You can start doing some just basic thoughts in your own head and discover that maybe there's something else going on here. Maybe there's something else. But those questions weren't asked, um, and it wasn't pursued any further. And so you're left believing that the value isn't the person. The value is what's in their wallet. And I had years later, when I started deconstructing, um, and I walked away. So I've been gone from that church now for a little over 2 years, I think. I'm trying to think. I left in 21. But previous to that, I had walked away from the church. I want to say it was 2019, I think, 2018, might have been 2018. I had walked away when my deconstruction had really kind of to start. And nobody recognized I was gone until the administrator ran a financial report and discovered that, oh, wow, there's thousands of dollars missing because this guy walked out the door. And then all of a sudden, the pastor's calling me to figure out what happened. We haven't seen you in a while. And able to ask a few questions, and discovered that the only reason he had found out was because he was alerted by the administrator that this person's tithe had disappeared.
Puts a very different spin on the relationship, doesn't it?
It was very
Yeah.
eye-opening, and yet I still came back. But that's a whole other subject.
Yeah, that's another interview. There's an interesting thing that I picked up on earlier that I wanted to hit on real quick is this sense of insider need, I guess I'd call it, where a lot of the church dynamics of keeping people involved, and listening to the Bodies Behind the Bus podcast, some others that talk about like Mark Driscoll's ministry, um, Acts 29, and how those churches function. Points to this sense of using a person's craving of being part of a group to, I'll put it the worst possible spin on it, to manipulate them into serving the church, either physically with their time, with their efforts, or financially with their money. And certainly in this case, this whole idea of tying into your fitness to be part of the inside group, the leadership ministry, is um, I think it's playing on a psychological need, not a perhaps in an unhealthy way, maybe in a way that the church doesn't even recognize. One of the things I want to get to next is this idea of the brokenness versus the ideal. So, we'll go there, but I just wanted to poke at this thing about insider thing.
Yeah, it's so much of the way we've structured, and I can only comment on Western church, right? I can't comment on anything outside of my own Western experience,
Sure.
because I know there are so many other experiences, and in particular, my experience is confined to kind of the Pentecostal charismatic realm. Um, there's so many other expressions of faith out there beyond just the small little world that I lived in for decades. But in the world where I lived, it's you had that, if you don't tithe, you can't be a part of the leadership group. But beyond that, there's a bigger thing attached to how we do ministry within, I'll just say, evangelicalism. And there's this huge push constantly. Like, one of the biggest things I had to deconstruct was, what does my life mean now that I'm no longer in the church? Because my whole purpose was tied up in
Yeah.
fulfilling something inside this thing. And so you're left with this emptiness because you're like, I need to be doing something for God.
Mm-hmm.
Like God needs me to do something for him, which is the most, it's hubris on steroids. It's like, oh, God needs me to do something for him. But from the pulpit, continuously, you're told, to be part of this body, you need to discover your purpose and be doing something for God. And so if you want to be in, you've got to figure out what that thing is, and you got to be chasing that thing. And and when people start to discover that their identity isn't wrapped up in what they're doing, that's not who you're at. Your identity isn't what you do. Sam Solon talks about that all the time, and this is another one of those things where I didn't realize he was talking about us to us. Is it's and so you have this drive within evangelicalism to always find that thing that is yours, so you can fit in, so you can, whether it's, like at the church where we went, it was always like, are you going to be involved in hospitality ministry? Are you going to be involved as an usher? You need to be involved somewhere. Get plugged in somewhere so you can discover your purpose. Be part of the in group. Be in. And there was always those people who just, I call them the floaters. They floated around the margins at the
Mm-hmm.
church, but they could just never plug in because they just didn't fit any of those molds. And they always felt so alienated at our church. I talked to many of them, but they would just keep poking around, trying to see where they could fit because they desperately wanted to be part of the group. So that whole psychology thing, yeah, I think we've become masters of it in the Western church, masters of trying to figure out how to use that psychology to get people on board. Um, and I don't have time for it anymore.
It's shocking when you see it from the outside for the first time and discover that it's there, and it was just such a part of life. It's like the fish realizing that there's water. It's just
Yeah,
not going to happen until you're outside of it.
yeah.
So the last thing well, before I go there, you mentioned our joint spiritual father, our mutual spiritual father, and he's talked some about tithing to your spiritual father from time to time, and so that's an area that I'm still trying to come to terms with. Um, is that appropriate? Is that something that it has never affected our relationship, but he's made it clear that that's in his mind something that is valuable and expected. So I'm kind of curious how you feel about that these days.
So I don't know that I've come to settled on any particular stance or position on tithing right now, other than to say, so for instance, I don't quote unquote tithe to Sam right now. I feel no obligation to do so. I do give my money very freely in many other areas. Where I see a need, I'll I'll give very freely. probably more freely than I've ever given in my life, because now there's no compunction, nothing that tells me I have to do it. I do it because I see that
It's from
God
the heart.
he has blessed me and has been very generous to me. Um, so I haven't, like I said, I don't tithe to Sam, and I should probably spend a little bit more time thinking about that question. But I don't know that I've landed on an answer for where I stand currently, other than to say tithing as we understand it, I don't believe in that as we used to understand it. I no longer
Yeah.
believe in that thing, whatever that is. It's, to me, it's very ugly. Um, and maybe it was just taught incorrectly. Um, maybe it was, I shouldn't say maybe, it was abused frequently. So it would take a pretty big 180 for me for somebody to explain to me how I could embrace that idea again, that idea of tithing, um, because it
And
is.
so that's a good lead into my final thought here was about the idea of, um, we've been talking a lot about a specifically broken model that we grew up under, in broken in certain ways. I think there's probably some truth mixed in with it, but I think there's more admixture there than health. Um, that doesn't. One of the common critiques I hear about people that are in the deconstruction or the critical mode are that they take examples from the worst stuff that happens and use that to justify throwing the whole baby out. So, are there goods? Are there things that for example, to me, one of the goods might be teaching people to think outside their own head, think about outside their own needs. It's in some ways, perhaps it's a way of getting people to realize that their responsibility is to a wider community than themselves in a tangible way, as opposed to a you know aspirational way. The downside, I guess, is that it teaches you about this McDonald's church of I just throw money at them and they do all the work. And it removes us from that sense of what is the Lord calling me to in my sphere of influence and the needs that circulate around me. And so it removes. So maybe there's a good thing, maybe there's a bad thing. How do we? What goodness would there be that we're missing?
I think there is a great deal of good, um, in in church. There's a lot of stuff that sits underneath the surface that was the original basis for church, um, that has just been built on top of layer after layer after layer. I kind of look at it like, you ever seen those, in China, there's that whole entire city that they continue to build. I think it's in China where they've built it on top of each other. They just keep building and building and building and building and building and building. You keep wondering, when is this thing going to fall down? Like, when is it going to cave in on itself? Because it just can't structurally be sound at some point in time. And I feel like that's what's happened with church. Um, is over time we've lost what's at the core, and Sam talks about that a lot. That we've lost track of what was at the core of the gospel message, and have just bastardized this thing to the point that it's not recognizable anymore, and it's become so busted that now it's abusing the people within it. It's gotten to the point where it's now abusing people within it. This is why you see all the scandals that are just constantly erupting all the time. And but there is still that kernel that resides in there, that I think, teaching people to pursue God with their whole hearts, their soul, their minds, their bodies, pursuing God, that's a good thing. It's a very good thing. But we've warped it now. Like, just in the Pentecostal charismatic tradition, people chase that, what I call the spiritual high, so often. Instead of actually chasing God, they're chasing an experience of God. and not actual relationship with God. So they jump from one service to the next trying to find that emotional high. So they go where there's really excellent worship so they can get that emotional high that they
Mm-hmm.
love so much. So, that's it's like we've grabbed on a hold of maybe some of the truth, but we've just employed it the wrong way, and turned it into these things that can just really do some serious damage. And I don't. I used to be pretty bitter. But the bitterness has gone now at this place, and it's not been replaced with. I have empathy now, and I'm okay. Like millions and millions and millions of people still go to churches. They go to these Sunday churches, and they believe very sincerely what they believe, and they practice very sincerely the practices that they go about practicing, ignorant to the fact of what damage is being done. Um, but I've got to be in a place where I can't hold that against them. I
Yeah.
can't. I just simply cannot.
It's looking back from stage 3 or stage 4 faith at the stage 1 or stage 2 people and recognizing that's where they are, and that's fine. We can work against what we see as the damage, but we have to be okay with the people.
Yeah, I continue. So my whole thought process right now is like you. I think I have many people, former members from our church, that'll float through my orbit on a fairly regular basis. They float through my orbit. There's many that you and I are both in a relationship that have been departed from there for a while, and we're in relationship with them. But there's others that they said they float through my orbit, and we'll have a conversation, and they'll express to me they're a bit melancholy about what was and how did it get to where it is, um and trying to understand what that pain is that they're feeling, and that sense of, I don't want to say betrayal, but there's just this sense of, man, something wasn't right. Something
Yeah.
just wasn't right. I I had the blog a long time that you're aware of. I called it Church Sucks. It was like people just tell me, church just sucks. Like it just sucks. Like what is wrong that I think this? You know, and,
Yep.
be careful if you say that stuff out loud.
Especially if you're still hanging around. Yeah. Well, I appreciate your time on this. There's no answers. I think
No.
we learned from each other here, and I've heard your story before, so I wasn't surprised by any of that. But it's good to put it into a particular context and tease out how that context is affected by our experiences. And one of the challenges for me right now is certainly trying to degeneralize, in the sense that I need to accept that my own experience was my own experience. It is not totally common to all of churchianity.
Yep.
And to accept that there are things that the Lord is doing on this earth through the institutions that I refuse to participate in today that probably are still quite good. And so it kind of comes down to walking my own road, and staying in fellowship with people that keep me pointed towards the Lord, but not insisting that it looks like it used to. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
that's I think where we both are at some level.
Yeah. 100%. 100%. It's God's going to continue to use. He's going to continue to use this broken institutional model of church. He's going to use it, even if it's just to highlight those things that need to be corrected, which I think he's doing a lot of that. But I think for me, if I had one prayer recently, one of my prayers recently is for exactly these types of conversations like you and I are having to become the norm, to become the standard, for it to be okay to have these kinds of conversations, and not be threatened for the church. And I'm not talking the institutional church anymore. I'm even just talking about the church writ large, to be okay with these conversations, because it's not just evangelicalism that we're seeing unravel right now.
Yeah.
You know, the Catholic Church is in the middle of all this. There's all the different denominations in one way or another experiencing the same exact thing. And the first thing that an institution tries to do is shut down anything that it can see as dissent.
Yeah.
It pulls those walls in, and it starts to protect itself.
Boundary set church.
Yeah. So if these conversations could just become the norm and not be hostile, just a genuine heart to understand, I don't understand your experience and what you're going through, but I'm going to honor you as a lover of Christ. I'm going to honor you because I do think you love Christ. So how do I listen to you without becoming offended, and that's so much of just the world today in general. I mean,
Yep.
even beyond the church, right? Is the division that we're seeing. But that's
And
my
look,
prayer.
that's where the church has light today, isn't it? You know, we have the opportunity to show a better way to relate to fellow humans and to move us forward in, you know, in righteous behavior towards each other, whether or not we call that Christian or not. So I think that's a
Yeah.
good place to end. I appreciate your time.
Yeah.
You know, love to talk to you about some other topic again soon.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right.